So I'd like to begin today by expressing my gratitude to Mark Oakley. He's the Dean of St. John's College, Cambridge. Last month, he preached a homily in Stratford-upon-Avon as part of a celebration of Shakespeare's birthday. And that homily helped me to think about Shakespeare's poems in new ways. And I'll be drawing on a few of the texts and ideas that Mark Oakley discusses in his homily. If you're interested in watching it, you can find it at the link at the bottom of this slide. So I'm shifting my attention today from Shakespeare's plays to his sonnets. Here they are as they appeared in print for the first time in 1609. These poems are very dense, as you may have discovered reading just two of them. Form and content work together in complex ways. They reward frequent rereading. I think that they're like the river into which Heraclitus stepped. No sonnet is ever quite the same when we read it the next time. So I selected only two for today so that we can read them closely together. And trust me when I say that no detail is unworthy of notice and mention. Every choice that Shakespeare makes in these poems is likely to bear meaning. And I hope that when we come to the discussion, you'll share how these sonnets make sense to you. In terms of the approach that I'll be taking to sonnets in general, I just want to say that I will not be reading them as though the entire sequence has a plot with three main characters who are caught in a love triangle. The idea that sonnets 1 through 126 are addressed by an older man to a younger man, and that sonnets 127 through 154 are addressed by the same older man to a woman, has endured since the late 18th century, thanks to this man, Edmund Malone, a brilliant reader and early editor of Shakespeare's works. Malone rescued the sonnets from a kind of oblivion into which they'd fallen after the mid-17th century. He wasn't the first Enlightenment editor to bring them back into print, but in 1780, Malone gave the sonnets the dignity of a critical apparatus for the first time. And in 1790, he became the first person to print the sonnets as part of an edition of Shakespeare's complete works. In his first footnote to his edition of the sonnets, Malone asserted what has been called the myth of the two groups. And here you see it next to the manicule in the left-hand margin. Here it is up close. To this person, whoever he was, 126 of the following poems are addressed. The remaining 28 are addressed to a lady. So for Malone, the interest of the sonnets was that they shed light on Shakespeare's own life. He read them as episodes in an autobiography. The critical tradition no longer thinks of the sonnets in that way, but Malone's idea that the first 126 are to a fair youth and the remaining 28 are about a dark lady has survived many reassessments, most recently in the 1990s. I don't really take a position on Malone's argument, except to say that the more we focus on the sequence as a kind of novel, the less open we are to other ways of reading the poems. And in fact, approximately 5/6 of the first 126 sonnets, and slightly less than that proportion in the entire sequence, don't specify the gender of the person to whom the poem is written. The sonnets are mainly addressed from I to you or to thou, and I'll have something to say about the distinction between you and thou a little bit later. And that fact appeals to me as an invitation to consider what the sonnets have in common with another sequence of love lyrics that was widely known and admired during the Renaissance, the Book of Psalms. So in 1840, at the height of the Victorians' enthusiasm for Shakespeare, Thomas Carlyle described Shakespeare's complete works in this way. And I wonder if I could have a reader to read this paragraph.
How about Irene, since she's in our Psalms group?
Oh, please do, Irene.
Well, thank you very much. I feel very honoured. So no narrow superstition, harsh asceticism, intolerance, fanatical fierceness or perversion, a revelation so far as it goes, which let all men worship as they can. We may say without offence that there rises a kind of universal psalm out of this Shakespeare too, not unfit to make itself heard among the still more sacred psalms, not in disharmony with these, if we understand them, but in harmony.
Thank you very much. So as I pondered what Carlyle might have meant last week, it occurred to me that, like the Psalms, Shakespeare's sonnets are poems praising the beauty and compassion and justice of a living being whose excellence is greater than language can compass. Fair, kind, and true is all my argument, he says in Sonnet 105. Moreover, those acts of praise occur in the midst of an ongoing exploration of the passions and needs and drives, both humane and inhumane, that are our lot as humankind. A few decades after Carlyle, Dante Gabriel Rossetti wrote this sonnet, asserting in line 1 that a sonnet is a moment's monument. And therefore, he says in line 5, look that it be, whether for lustral rite or dire portent, of its own intricate fullness, reverent. I think intricate fullness is a marvelous way to describe the complexity and meaningfulness of Shakespeare's sonnets, but in what sense might they be reverent? So my way of beginning to answer that question today is to share with you a poem by Anthony Thwaite. It's not a sonnet, but it captures the spirit of the approach I'm going to take to Shakespeare today. And so I offer it to you without comment as a last prologue to what I'm about to say about 60 and 120. And Julia, would you read this poem for us?
Sure. These old arcane contritions, ancient sounds compounded of such alien traditions, Shinto, Judaic, Syriac, Hindu, thread beseeched wails with solemn ululations over the holy places, over the buried dead. Canticle, Veda, Sutra chant their still archaic keening among the killing grounds, the darkness into which their pure sound spills. Something to do with love, with grief, with death. All share this common melody, ascend and fall and rise again, repeat again, cadences that return, that never end, until the melisma of extended pain shudders and drops in wordless, stubborn stress, with resignation, with exhausted breath, over the risen hope, over the hopelessness.
Thank you very much. And please keep that in mind to discuss later if you wish. It's a wonderful poem, and I recommend his poetry to you. All right, so to get underway with Sonnet 60, here it is as it appeared in 1609. It's divided between 2 pages. And here is the text of the modern Folger Shakespeare Library edition. And Patty Gallagher has generously agreed to read this sonnet for us. So Patty, when you're ready, take it away.
Great. Like as the waves make toward the pebbled shore, so do our minutes hasten to their end. Each changing place with that which goes before, in sequent toil all forwards do contend. Nativity, once in the main of light, crawls to maturity, wherewith being crowned, crooked eclipses 'gainst his glory fight. And time that gave doth now his gift confound. Time doth transfix the flourish set on youth, and delves the parallels in beauty's brow, feeds on the rarities of nature's truth, and nothing stands but for his scythe to mow. And yet, to times in hope my verse shall stand, praising thy worth, despite his cruel hand.
Thank you very much, Patty. So Sonnet 60 is a classically English or Shakespearean sonnet. It has 3 quatrains, each with a distinctive rhyme pattern, followed by a couplet. The first quatrain compares the movement of time to waves crashing on the shore. The second quatrain adopts a different perspective on time and talks about the movement from birth to old age in a human life. The repetition of the double consonant CR in crawls, crowned, and crooked is acoustically equivalent to the kind of movement that the lines are describing. we hear the progress from birth to old age in that sound, I think. The first syllable of the final rhyme word in the second quatrain also echoes the first syllable of the final rhyme word in the first quatrain, suggesting, again in the ear, something stretching forward and slipping backward, like waves falling on the shore. In the final line of the second quatrain, time has become time with a capital T, and the third quatrain reflects on the damage that time does to beauty's face with his scythe, etches lines in it. In line 12, the rhyme word no is just different enough from its companion in line 9 to suggest that as the sonnet moves forward from beginning to end, something has been lopped off. That is the sound that the diphthong makes in brow. The concluding couplet contradicts the conclusions about time that the other lines have drawn. And to emphasize that point, the couplet picks up the words time from line 8 and stands in line 12 and changes their meaning by changing their number and tense. Criticism about Sonnet 60 has generally focused on the first quatrain and the influence of Ovid's Metamorphoses that makes itself felt there. Here is the title page of Arthur Golding's translation of Ovid from 1567. This is the translation that Shakespeare knew well. Ezra Pound called it the most beautiful book in the English language. The first quatrain of Sonnet 60 is taken from a long speech that the philosopher Pythagoras makes in Book 15 of Ovid's poem. Julia and I have spoken about Pythagoras a few times in the series, but I don't think we've ever showed you his portrait. Here's one I dug up from a 16th century manuscript. You can see him there social distancing from a cluster of fava beans. So evidently, there are a few things that friends do not hold in common. Sorry, that's my joke. It's very hard not to hear any of you laughing after I give it. So moving on. So here are the lines that Shakespeare is imitating in Sonnet 60 in Golding's translation. But look, as every wave drives other forth, and that comes behind both thrusteth and is thrust itself, even so the times by kind do fly and follow both at once. Golding's variation on the verb to thrust, which you see highlighted here, is his attempt to replicate in English a really marvelous effect that Ovid has achieved in Latin. In the second line of Latin verse on this slide, Ovid creates the effect of waves moving by taking advantage of the fact that Latin adjectives, prior and priorum, and verbs, orgetur and orget, have different endings depending on the kind of work that they do in a sentence. Even without knowing that the line means the preceding wave is pushed along by the coming wave and pushes the wave that precedes it, you can hear the meaning in the variations of the phrases on either side of the word veniente. Orgetur, the verb in the first part of the line, loses a syllable and becomes orget, while the lost syllable seems to attach itself to the adjective prior, which becomes priorum in the second part of the line. And to a lesser extent, the repetition of pariter, which means equal or equally, achieves the same effect in the next line. Shakespeare was clearly thinking about both Ovid and Golding when he wrote Sonnet 60. The fourth line of the first quatrain picks up Ovid's verb sequuntur and turns it into the unusual adjective sequent. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, this is the earliest recorded use of sequent to mean something forming an unbroken series or course or consecutive. Shakespeare also tries his hand at replicating what Ovid can do in Latin. After nearly 3 lines of mostly one-syllable words, the fourth line of the first quatrain swells with 2-syllable words. And I think he's trying to create the impression there of tidal movement, but he's using the stress pattern of the line rather than the word endings. In sequent toil, all forwards do contend. For all of his close imitation of the form and content of Ovid's poem and Golding's translation, however, Shakespeare also diverges from them in the second quatrain. At the end of the passage that he's imitating, Pythagoras emphasizes that all of the changes that time brings with it ultimately lead to renewal. And you see the phrase highlighted there. Yeah. As he expands the doctrine of metempsychosis, or transmigration of souls, Pythagoras is clear that while everything changes, nothing dies. One thing moves here, another there, he says, but the sum of all things is constant. That is not what Shakespeare writes in Sonnet 60. In place of a life-affirming Pythagoras, Shakespeare puts time as the Renaissance knew him. This is time in his aspect as Cronus, carrying a scythe, and in the ribbon that he's speaking there, he's saying that only virtue can stand against this blade. I think that if we attune ourselves to the presence of Time the Reaper in this sonnet, we will become more sensitive to the influence of other books that Shakespeare knew well. For example, in line 8, at the end of the second quatrain, there is an echo of Job 1:21, which opens the order for the burial of the dead in the 1559 Book of Common Prayer. Quote, "We brought nothing into this world, neither may we carry anything out of this world. The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away," unquote. Line 12 also gestures to the burial service. "Man that is born of woman hath but a short time to live, and is full of misery. He cometh up and is cut down like a flower. He flieth as it were a shadow, and never continueth in one stay." In its reference to mowing, this line might also invoke Psalm 103. Here is the relevant passage in the translation from Miles Coverdale's Psalter in 1535. Would someone like to read these verses?
"Yea, like as a father pitieth his own children, even so is the Lord merciful unto them that fear him. For he knoweth whereof we are made. He remembereth that we are but dust. The days of man are but as grass, for he flourisheth as a flower of the field. For as soon as the wind goeth over it, it is gone, and the place thereof shall know it no more."
Thank you, K2. So I'm drawing your attention to this psalm because it suggests that the frailty of the human condition is not only a measurement of human worth, but also the condition of possibility for forgiveness, which is an idea that I want to explore in relation to Sonnet 120. For the moment, however, I want to suggest that these allusions to the burial service and to Psalm 103 sharpen our awareness of that phrase, "thy worth," in the final line of Sonnet 60. How should we understand what a human life is worth in light of all the passages that Shakespeare brings to bear in this sonnet? From Psalms, from Job, from the Book of Common Prayer, from Ovid's Metamorphoses, as testimonies to the transience of a human life. If you've spent any time reading the sonnets, you will know that thy worth is a recurring topic. It would not be an exaggeration to say that it is the central topic of the sequence. Sonnet 39 asks the question that all but a few sonnets explore: what kind of language would be adequate to the task of describing thy worth? Sonnet 18 famously seeks an answer in a comparison between thee and a summer's day, concluding, "Thou art more lovely and more temperate." The same kind of comparison is in play in Sonnet 29, which reaches the conclusion that thy sweet love is a wealth worth more than the state of kings. Sonnet 38 announces that thou art the 10th muse, 10 times more in worth than those old 9 which rhymers invocate. Sonnet 53 compares you to Adonis and Helen of Troy, figures of the utmost beauty in ancient literature, only to conclude that they are imitated after you. Sonnet 106 makes a similar claim about your worth in comparison to ladies dead and lovely knights in beautiful old rhyme. And whereas Adonis and Helen were imitated after you, the knights and ladies of medieval romance are said to prefigure you. And I really regret that we don't have time to give these sonnets the attention that they deserve. I'm mentioning them as I pass on to Sonnet 120 in order to give you a sense of a contrast between sonnets like these that assert what you are worth by comparing you favorably to something else, and a sonnet like 120 that demonstrates a different way of thinking about your worth as it takes up the topic of forgiveness. Here is Sonnet 120, the way it looked in 1609. Again, it's divided onto 2 pages. And here is the Folger edition of the sonnet. Paul Whitworth has generously offered to read for us. So Paul, whenever you're ready, have at it.
That you were once unkind, befriend me now, and for that sorrow which I then did feel, needs must I under my transgression bow, unless my nerves were brass or hammered steel. For if you were by my unkindness shaken, as I by yours, you've passed a hell of time, and I, a tyrant, have no leisure taken to weigh how once I suffered in your crime. Oh, that our night of love might have remembered my deepest sense, how hard true sorrow hits, and soon to you, as you to me then tendered the humble salve which wounded bosoms fits. But that your trespass now becomes a fee, mine ransoms yours, and yours must ransom me.
Thank you so much, Paul. So, I think a first reading of this poem suggests that it is organized in the same way that 60 is organized. 3 quatrains, each with a distinctive rhyme scheme, followed by a couplet. However, a second reading reveals, and so there are the quatrains and there's the couplet. A second reading reveals, however, that it might be more appropriate to describe the sonnet's organization in terms of an octave and a sestet. In sonnets that are organized in 8 and 6 line sections, the octave typically states a question or a problem to which the sestet responds. The joint between octave and sestet, which usually comes at the 9th line of the poem, is called a volta, or a turn. And in Sonnet 120, the phrase, "our night of woe," signals that this turn is occurring. This phrase is the only place in the sonnet where the poet uses the first person plural pronoun as opposed to the first and second person singular pronouns. And I'll return to the importance of pronouns in the sonnet in a moment. But first, I want to make sure you understand how 120 is handling the topic of time. In Sonnet 60, time appears as waves falling on the shore and the span of a human life, and then as a mower. By contrast, in 120, time takes the form of 3 different moments in a relationship between I and you. The sonnet identifies these moments with adverbs and also with the phrase, "our night of woe." And I'm going to take you through them in chronological order, but bear in mind, as you just heard, the sonnet moves back and forth between them before gesturing toward the future in the final line. Okay, so first there is what I will call the distant past, indicated by the adverbs once and then at the start of the poem. What happened then? Well, you wronged me, I suffered, you sought my forgiveness, and I forgave you. Next, there is the more recent past. The phrase, "our night of woe" in line 9 refers to this moment. At that time, I wronged you and you suffered, but having forgotten about the events in the distant past, I did not seek forgiveness from you. And I think the reader is left to assume, therefore, that you did not forgive me, which brings us to the present in which I am writing this sonnet. In the present, which is indicated by the adverb now at the beginning and end of the poem, I remember the distant past when you apologized to me, and I regret not only that I did not make you what I did to make you suffer during the recent past, but also that I did not apologize to you at that time. An apology is the humble salve which wounded bosoms fits, in line 12. And by writing this sonnet, I seek forgiveness now and expect that we will ransom each other once you have finished reading the poem. Now, I said earlier that pronouns are important in 120. There are 117 words in this sonnet, and approximately 20% of them are either the first or second person singular pronoun, I or you or some form of those words. And that's not a coincidence given the sonnet's concerns. Only 34 of the sonnets are addressed to you rather than thou, and to Renaissance ears, this distinction was meaningful. In general, one used thou when speaking to social inferiors or to express intimacy, but you when speaking to people in superior positions or to be formal and respectful. So the poet's use of you in this sonnet might suggest both the esteem in which I hold you and the fact that there is a breach between us, because I stand in an inferior moral position to you. Unlike you, I did not confess my fault and seek forgiveness when I could have done that, and therefore I have become a tyrant. There are 10 places where 120 uses you, in contrast to 13 uses of the first person singular pronoun. If you look at them together, I in red and you in yellow, something interesting comes to light. Whereas the first person pronoun is often alone in a line, 2, 3, 4, 7, and 10, the second person pronoun is alone only once, in line 13. As often as not, I and you appear in the same line, 1, 5, 6, 8, 11, and 14. And now if you'll tolerate what I'm about to do, consider the relationship between I and you when I take away all of the other words in the poem. A picture of sorts begins to emerge. In the upper half of the text block, where the octave is, there are approximately twice as many first-person pronouns as there are second-person pronouns. The sonnet's first line puts you and me, or you and me literally, at a wide distance from each other. And 4 of these lines isolate the first-person pronoun unto itself. In the lower half of the text block, where the sestet is, there are almost equal numbers of first and second-person pronouns. The second-person pronouns are gathered into the center or near the center of the lines in which they occur, and they seem to be embraced by the first-person pronouns around them. The final line of the poem reiterates in its own form the change that's occurring in the sestet as a whole. I embraced you, and we stand on equal footing. Now, doubtless you have already recognized or remembered that the pivotal moment in this movement of pronouns from alienation and self-absorption to concern for another person and a new relationship comes in line 9, the only use of the first person plural pronoun in the whole poem. Along with the poet's use of the subjunctive mood in lines 5 and 6, this is the imaginative leap that surmounts the barrier that rose between them during our night of woe, and it leads to the possibility of mutual forgiveness. There's the subjunctive in lines 5 and 6. So, the repeated word ransom in the sonnet's last line is my cue to return to the topic of worth. What does ransom mean? Well, according to the OED, the primary definition of ransom as a noun is a sum of money in payment for an offense. And as a verb, somewhat surprisingly, ransom primarily means to deliver or redeem a person from sin, especially with reference to the Passion of Christ. Within Shakespeare's sonnets as a whole, the word ransom connects 120 to sonnet 34, which is on the whole a more lighthearted handling of the theme of forgiveness. In 34, you encourage me to believe that the weather is going to be nicer than it actually turns out to be, I go outside without a cloak and get soaked in the rain. And although you apologize to me, I am initially reluctant to forgive you, thinking the offender's sorrow lends but weak relief to him that bears strong offense's cross. But sure enough, your tears of contrition make things right in the end, for they are rich and ransom all ill deeds. Ransom occurs only 3 times in Shakespeare's sonnets, once in the final line of 34 and twice in the final line of 120. And if you look further back in 34, you'll find the words salve and wound, which also occur in 120. Wound occurs in several sonnets, but salve occurs only here in 120. And so together, wound, salve, and ransom seem to be a skeletal plot on which all acts of forgiveness are fleshed out. In 120, ransom's definition as a sum of money is evoked in the 3rd quatrain by the words tendered and fee. Earlier in the sonnet, the word transgression points to ransom's other definition. Now that's very speculative on my part, but as I was preparing for this talk, I made a surprising discovery, and it is that the only time that ransom and transgression appear in the same passage of the Geneva Bible, which is the Bible that Shakespeare knew best, is this verse from Proverbs 21. The wicked shall be a ransom for the just, and the transgressor for the righteous. The Geneva Bible is a scholarly Bible. It's full of erudite notes, and this verse has a gloss of its own. God shall cause that to fall on their own heads, which they, that is to say the wicked, intended against the just, by delivering the just and putting the wicked in their places. I don't think Shakespeare has any interest in the just and the wicked in Sonnet 120, but perhaps this passage and its note led him to the thought that putting oneself in place of another person is an essential part of forgiving and of being forgiven. And here again are the relevant lines. What do we discover when we put ourselves in another person's place? In this sonnet, the poet discovers what it's like to suffer. And here I want to draw your attention one last time to Psalm 103, this time in the Geneva Bible translation. As a father hath compassion on his children, so hath the Lord compassion on them that fear him. For he knoweth whereof we be made. He remembereth that we are but dust. The days of man are as grass, as a flower of the field, so flourisheth he. For the wind goeth over it, and it is gone, and the place thereof shall know it no more. Now, I can't say that these verses from Psalm 103 have a very direct relationship to Sonnet 120. On the other hand, they praise God's compassion by saying that God knows what it is to be a human being. And what's more, the verse describing human life as grass comes with an intriguing note. He declareth, that is the psalmist, he declareth that man hath nothing in himself to move God to mercy, but only the confession of his infirmity and misery. Here is another text that might have informed the approach that Shakespeare takes to forgiveness in 120. The Christian annotator of this psalm supposes not only that God knows what it's like to be human, but also that we obtain mercy by acknowledging our frailty. In Shakespeare's most famous lines about mercy from The Merchant of Venice, Portia imperiously tells Shylock that mercy is an attribute of God himself. And so it is, from the perspective of the Incarnation, a miraculous event in Christian theology in which a blameless creator freely puts himself in the place of fallen creatures and redeems them. Forgiveness is altogether less exalted in Sonnet 120. There, the power to forgive resides in all too human you and me, transient and peccable life forms who both suffer and cause suffering. Now, according to Chekhov, man will become better when you show him what he is like. In Sonnet 35, Shakespeare says, all men make faults. But Sonnet 120, like Psalm 103, suggests that our faulty nature is the reason why we can forgive and be forgiven, and therefore that it is the essence of our value to each other. Thank you.
It seems seems to me that it's moved to the concept of forgiveness as, from the Protestant New Testament, which of course there's the Reformation not too long before then, right? So it's the reflection of the concept of forgiveness and mercy as something that God gives through faith, not by works. That's just what I took from it. From that part of it.
Yeah, you're quite right. Look, maybe I should say to begin that I don't think that Shakespeare is much of a theologian. I do think he is a kind of fly trap for every text that he ever read or heard read aloud, right? And that's why I focused on the Coverdale Psalter as a potential source for his work in these sonnets, and also on the Geneva Bible. There's a lot of interesting scholarship about what Shakespeare was doing with the Geneva Bible, and other people, such as Barbara Mowat, who used to be at the Folger Shakespeare Library, showed that Shakespeare is actually reading the notes in the Geneva Bible when he looks at, for example, the parable of the prodigal son. So there is a basis for thinking that he's actually down in these scholarly weeds with us. As for where he's locating the capacity for forgiveness, to take up Amira's point, I think one of the things that is conspicuous about the sonnets is that we're sort of all in this alone together. There really is no God that makes itself manifested in the sonnets. And so there's an open question, I think, about the degree to which he's trying to humanize this aspect of Christian theology so completely that it no longer needs to depend on theology. That is one possibility.
And there's comments in the chat from both Jewish and Christian texts in terms of forgiveness and mercy. So it's interesting to me that Shakespeare is drawing on a lot of so-called Old Testament texts here, the Psalms and the Proverbs.
Yeah.
But reading them in a way that is resonant with Christian theology conceived broadly as not simply Reformation. I see that as part of Shakespeare's ecumenicalism. And going back to that wonderful poem that you had me read at the beginning, which included not only Judaism and Christianities, in their plural, but also these other traditions. So that really interests me. And even rooting this in Pythagoras and Ovid, it's like Ovid, yes, but it's also Pythagoras as this really fascinating figure of the global travels of wisdom. So Pythagoras was, active in Samos, which was Greek-speaking Italy, but he supposedly, studied in Egypt and Syria and Persia, and it kind of combines, sort of all the wisdoms of the Mediterranean, and then enters Ovid as kind of a Roman poet. So all of that just really kind of fascinates me, coming out of our readings last week of Cleopatra and the polytheistic sources of woman wisdom in Proverbs. So anyway, I'm so stimulated and excited by all of this, which is not exactly a question, but an affirmation and reframing of what you're doing here in the context of a whole series that's supposed to be on Shakespeare and wisdom. And that is so much the recurrent topic. It's really great.
Irene, Julia said before we started that you study the Psalms and Proverbs and other Jewish Bible matters. So I wonder if you have anything to say about that Psalm or that proverb in particular.
Well, first of all, I'd just like to say how blown away I am by the standard of your scholarship. amazing. I started the subject of biblical Hebrew at Liverpool University and then Jewish history. That's my background, and I'm a translator. What I do want to say is I've worked a lot actually on The Merchant of Venice, which I had to act in at school, and I had to be Shylock at a girls' school. Yeah, but it's interesting because I didn't mind the anti-Semitism sort of was not important. What's important was what you just recited, the Portia's speech. And then I did some research, and there's a poet in Israel, in what's known as Palestine, in the first 3 centuries, probably CE, called Eliezer ben Kalir, and his poetic style transferred to Italy, which, as you probably know, did not expel any of its Jews, at least not officially, unlike England, France, Germany, etc. And that, as you know, Shakespeare got a lot of his stuff from Italy, and some of his poems on rain, R-A-I-N, are very similar to the Quality of Mercy. So I'm friendly with Rowan Williams, who I notice is very keen on that man that you mentioned from Cambridge. I did some research just now, Oxford, sorry. He used some of my work in, there's a Shakespeare conference every 2 or 3 years in UK, and they invited him because he's very good at English literature as well as theology. And so that's what I want to say is that apart from the Psalms and Proverbs, I think, you know much more about Shakespeare generally than I do, but to the person who said about the Protestant thing, there is some idea that Shakespeare was probably Catholic, if anything. And as you say, he wasn't a theologian. There was a lot of turmoil in the England of that time. So he may not have actually been a Protestant, as such. He took from both. So I don't think... I think the thing about Kippur, which I said, is interesting because Rowan and I have discussed the idea of ransom and what it means, the idea of ransom generally, not in the sonnets so much as in all the different meanings it has in English and also in the Bible, because there is actually, I hate to say it, no word for reconciliation in Hebrew. There is no word in modern Hebrew. They use a loan word, which means appeasement. I've checked with scholars in Israel. So there's actually, unlike Christianity that loves reconciliation, it seems to me, especially in this country, when there's also a lot that can't be reconciled, the cessation of hostilities, but there isn't reconciliation, I'm very sorry to say. The word in Hebrew is pios, which just means appeasement, and sounds like pious. It's a loan word. So I just want to say, this class is amazing. I'm going to tell Rowan about it tomorrow. You are both absolutely amazing. I haven't got your email, Julia, so I can't write to you. Fantastic. Anyway, thank you for asking me.
Thank you, Irene. We're really honored to have you here. There's some kind of related questions here in the chat. K2 is asking about the quality of mercy in Merchant of Venice. Is it different from the notions of forgiveness in Sonnet 120?
Yeah.
Kato, do you want to kind of formulate that maybe with your own sense of the matter?
Well, I was just wondering about the kind of correlations between mercy and forgiveness, and that, the two seem kind of different, at least within Merchant of Venice with the drama and then in the sonnet. But there are also correlations. So I was just curious about that. In terms of like a philosophical issue in Shakespeare.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
That's a terrific question. I do think in Merchant of Venice, he's really focused on the question of who has power to forgive. I guess that's what it comes down to. And the difficulty of sort of thinking through that clearly in Merchant of Venice is that at the moment that Portia talks about mercy as this godlike gift, she is behaving in the most coercive way possible, right? It's actually in Shylock's power to forgive, but because she's teaching him this lesson, which is going to result in his forced conversion, right, in order to keep some aspect of his former identity and his property, her coerciveness and the idea that one would have the power to forgive a debt gets sort of tangled up together. And I think you see a slight echo of that concern with power in an act of forgiveness in Sonnet 120 when he talks about having been a tyrant for not having apologized, right? But I do think that Sonnet 120 is attempting to reach a place both aesthetically in that final line and ethically where they are standing on a level field again, right? And engaging in some mutual cessation of hostilities or some mutual reciprocal gift of forgiveness. I mean, after all, the poem doesn't succeed in reconciling them until you says to I forgive you, right? Then they can move on. So that's the future to which the sonnet is sort of implicitly pointing at the end, the future in which the recipient of the poem responds to it. It is, of course, possible that you will become a tyrant after reading the poem that I wrote, right? Who imitates who? Kirk, you have your hand up. Did you want to ask a question?
Thank you.
Yes, I do, Sean. First of all, what a brilliant exposition. And yet I feel like we've only covered the surface of these two sonnets.
I know.
A question, authorship always rears its ugly head in the plays. There is some known scholarly works that have really strongly indicated that the later plays, the last plays, may have had some additional writers. What about the sonnets? Are they solidly Shakespeare, or is there some question there?
I'm not aware, actually, of any collaborative authorship question in relation to the sonnets. Although they, if you extend the concept of collaborative authorship to taking whole passages out of poets like Golding, right, then yes, they are collaboratively authored. But in fact, they are so distinctively his own. And I think there is a certain pressure in Elizabethan sonnet writers to distinguish themselves in the context of these highly regulated conventions, right? So I think if you spend some time with Spenser's sonnets, Sidney's sonnets, Shakespeare's sonnets, Donne's sonnets, for example, they do succeed in differentiating themselves, not only by topic or content, but also by approach to the enabling constraints of the sonnet form itself. They don't have the same metrical patterns. They don't do the same things internally to the line, and over time you can, what initially all sounds the same turns out to be very different kinds of birds singing on a wire.
Anna Lodekin has a question as well.
Hi, yes, I do. First of all, thank you so much for presenting this in such a fascinating way that a lot to think about that I had not thought of in my initial reading. And thank you to everyone for your contributions, especially thank you, Irene, bringing up this point of there not being a word for reconciliation in Hebrew. It's so interesting to me, and also puts me in mind of how I initially read Sonnet 120, which I didn't actually see. I see what you're saying now about there being this forgiveness aspect to it. And you made this point about how initially there was no apology. I wonder if there is, because how I initially read it, I didn't necessarily see those final lines as an apology. I agree with you that there is an equality there, but to me that, especially with the double meaning of the word ransom and that noun definition of it meaning a sum of money, it seems sort of more like, sort of tit for tat rather than a genuine apology. And so I'm sorry, I should form this into a question. I guess my question is, why do you necessarily see that ending as an apology? And
I think that's a great question. And I think
about forgiveness. Yeah.
No, I think that's a brilliant question. And I think you can't, once he's introduced tendered and fee in the third quatrain, I don't think you can escape the implication that he's bartering here, right? I mean, I'm suggesting that Sonnet 120 is the apology, right? That the event of the sonnet is his acknowledgement that he was in the wrong twice, and that the effort that he's put into the sonnet is the work of apologizing. But he does end up reminding you in the final line of the poem that you once wronged me in the past, right? I mean, there's a way in which the argument that we are equivalent and that therefore we have the power to forgive each other, right? That's the amazing thing about the sonnet from my perspective. It goes hand in hand with a refusal to forget the injury that you did to me in the past, right? Yours, I don't have it in front of me. Yeah. Mine ransoms yours and you must ransom me. That yours is referring to that you were unkind once, befriends me now. So, I mean, that is the best way that I can respond to your comment, that I think the sonnet invites a certain skepticism that a kind of bait and switch is going on, right? After all of this elegant footwork to try to get us into the same dance number again, at the end, it turns out that I'm still blaming you, and I expect you to stop blaming me on that score, right? But I'm trying to sort of move it in a happier direction by acknowledging that it, might come out of these other texts and traditions that are concerned with the possibility of forgiveness, the rooting of the possibility of forgiveness in human frailty.
There's a kind of emotional realism there.
Yeah.
We're almost out of time, and Jan and Brad Crenshaw, maybe you could each just make your comments off with the mic on, and then we'll probably kind of end quickly, and then people who want to stay for a little bit longer can do so.
May I just say that the word forgiveness is all very well and good. I forgive you, you forgive me. But if my hurt was so much deeper than yours, the words forgive do not necessarily mean what the lovely Christian meaning of forgiveness is. The hurts are not equal. So the surface forgiveness isn't necessarily equal at all, if that makes sense.
It's interesting that the psychological work, I agree with you, Jan. The psychological work on forgiveness, by psychologists, by clinical psychologists, interestingly says that, or at least some of the research, that forgiveness is much more valuable to the person who forgives than to the person who is forgiven, from a purely kind of reparative.
It's a lovely word, lovely thought, but not necessary. It ain't necessarily so.
Well, I would also agree that the only way that this sonnet works is by keeping completely ambiguous what the unkindnesses were, right? That you were unkind once, befriends me now. I mean, was it that he sent him out in the rain without a cloak, or that he punched him in the face, or that he slept with his girlfriend? I mean, there is a wide range of possible unkindnesses that this poem is trying to sort of compress into equivalence. I think if he was more specific about the wrongdoing, we wouldn't be able to have the conversation we're having. Would you agree, Julia?
Yes, I think that's
one size fits all.
Okay, we're going to let Brad had an interesting point about social reciprocity and the fabric of society.
If you can hear me this time, it seems to me that the I, in confessing his use of power and becoming tyrannical, to my mind, kind of renders mutual the offenses. I didn't pick up that one was more offended than the other. But what he is speaking to is the need for forgiveness to create the power of social reciprocity, and therefore just to be able among the social. I mean, I was thinking it refers back to our concepts of wisdom, and that in this mutual recognition of our frailty, we can also have a greater experience with each other rather than these tyrannical isolations.
And then Paul, one of our wonderful actor readers and a scholar in his own right. Paul, do you want to just a couple of words before we stop?
I've loved all this discussion, and it seemed I just wanted to say that as I was going over and over the poem, we haven't mentioned much about humor today, And one of the things that seems remarkable about this is that we're human beings. We're not made of brass or steel. And I can make you laugh. And I can make your trespass when you screwed someone else or whatever you did. It's now become a gift to me. It's a fee. And mine ransoms yours, so yours must ransom me. And the poem itself has turned these nights of infidelity into a witty, he's transformed them wittily into something which makes us human rather than steel or brass.
And we will talk about wit in our 8th and final meeting with you helping us, Paul, as Malvolio. So we're very excited about that. We'll be coming back to wit.